Coming to you from sunny South Carolina, it's the Palmetto Conservative Show with your host, Jim Lee. From the upstate to the low country, from the coast to Columbia, we'll cover what's right and uncover what's wrong in the Palmetto State. If we see it, we say it. We call it like it is in South Carolina. And now, it's the Palmetto Conservative Show. Let's jam.
Welcome into the Palmetto Conservative Show here on the Conservative Broadcast Media Network. I'm your host, Jim Lee, part political junkie, part technology geek, part commentator, and sometimes snarky agitator for the application of common sense and the pursuit of critical thinking in the marketplace of ideas, particularly as it relates to the Palmetto State. I don't profess to have all the answers, folks, just an awful lot of relevant questions. Probably just like you. Hope your week has been a good one thus far. Here we are on the middle of the week, hump day as it were. You're on the downhill slide if you measure Wednesday as the middle of your week. It is also the end of the first day of official day of spring. Now, hopefully spring has sprung where you're at. We see that global warming hasn't quite taken hold this year, as a bit of cool air seems to be over top of things this spring. But for me, down here in the Palmetto State, that's okay. I quite frankly would like to see an elongated spring that lasts more than about a week before we run headlong into the typical hot days of summer. But I digress. Usual and customary disclaimer here on the Palmetto Conservative Show. Not here to give a speech, not here to display rancor or vituperation, or to engender bitterness. I'm not here to throw around incendiary language, nor am I trying to incite violence of any kind. I am, however, hopeful that the views that you hear will tend to inflame your senses to pursue something that we desperately need more of in our political discourse, and that is critical thinking, something that we desperately lack these days. Here in the chair, ready to take on the cacistocracy this week, and it's not like they've made it easy. You know, I've been under a fair amount of pressure for a variety of reasons the last couple of weeks. A lot going on in my life, as I'm sure most of you, and watching the affairs of state, as it were, certainly hasn't lessened that burden. But I felt it necessary, coming out of the weekend, busy week in front of me, to disengage, to unplug, as it were, for a couple of days, and see if that didn't help my disposition. And so, really, the last couple of days, I've been out of the political view. I haven't paid that much attention to news, and as I was thinking about getting ready for this evening's program, I thought, oh no, what am I going to talk about for 2 hours? And in the brief time that it took me to prepare the program, and I do prepare for each of these, I typically over-prepare for these and have more material than I could possibly get through in a 2-hour program, or a 3-hour program for that matter. I found that the cacistocracy just won't let up, and they provide plenty of material, fodder, as we like to call it here, for the program. So here we are. Those of you new to the program, a cacistocracy is known as government by the worst persons, or a form of government in which the worst persons are in power. Very few that I can think of would disagree with me. That is where we find ourselves these days. Favorite quote that I like to use and tee up the perspective here is from Plato. He says that one of the penalties for refusing to participate in politics is that you end up being governed by your inferiors. And that, my friends, is where we find ourselves on most days, because those in Washington, those in our state houses, the geniuses that they are, continue to go about things in the usual and customary way, politics as usual, following the status quo, and we see where that's getting us. And it's not in a good direction. But anyway, glad that you're here. My couple of days away, I guess I can say that I share some sentiment with the President of the United States, as he was heard to say today as he stepped off the plane in Israel. And he told Benjamin Netanyahu that, boy, it's good to get away from Congress. Now, first of all, I was kind of shocked because I didn't realize that he was near Congress. I mean, certainly within physical proximity, but I really didn't know that he was aware that Congress was in town, that he was doing anything with them. But anyway, I'm sure the president felt real good. He had delivered his NCAA brackets, hit the town, hit the helicopter, and headed out of town on his way to his first trip to Israel. But that's where we find ourselves this week as we get underway. Where to begin? Well, first of all, if you are listening to this program and you consider yourself to be a proud wacko bird or a nullifier, you're in safe territory. You're welcome to wade on into the program and listen without fear of ridicule or being criticized simply for holding a position that, while it is intellectually permissible to argue, it is not intellectually permissible to simply dismiss out of hand the notion of nullification. And I'll tell you why. Number one, South Carolina just pushed some legislation out of subcommittees that would do just that. One piece of legislation around the nullification of Obamacare, and the other around the NDAA, indefinite detention laws. The Oklahoma State House passed a nullification of Obamacare law out of its House of Representatives. They're actually further ahead than South Carolina, because in South Carolina we've passed it out of a subcommittee to a full committee, and in hopes that the full committee will actually send that out to the floor for debate and a vote. Now, this is not to say that it necessarily is going to pass in South Carolina. We have a state legislature and a state senate that is famous for bringing legislation forward only to see to it that it dies on the vine, particularly over on the Senate side of things. But anyway, today in the state capitol there was the second hearing of the South Carolina House of Representatives Judicial Subcommittee, and hearing testimony regarding a bill in South Carolina, House Bill 3101, that seeks to declare null and void the Obamacare bill, the federal Obamacare legislation. When this move was begun, when this legislation was pre-filed, it was immediately predicted to die in committee. It would never see the light of day, and yet here we are. There have been two hearings. There have been experts to come testify on the notion of interposition or nullification, and oddly enough, once the teeth were taken out of this bill, it actually gained enough support to get out of subcommittee. And what I mean by that is that the bill originally contained penalties, fines and penalties that could be levied against any federal agents who attempted to enforce Obamacare within the state boundaries. Now, those penalties have been removed, and politics being the art of the possible, I suppose that's to have been expected. In the testimony today of two expert witnesses, one none other than Walter E. Williams, a professor of economics at George Mason, I believe, and a regular fill-in for Rush Limbaugh on his talk radio program, but also one who writes a weekly column on all sorts of things of critical thought about common sense and constitutionality and things. In his remarks to the committee, he pointed out that it was time for states like South Carolina to muster up the courage of the founders to stand up for what is right. The other witness today, Kent Masterson Brown, who is a constitutional attorney and a historian and author, had some interesting things to say about the Obamacare bill itself that I found to be fascinating. You know, there are very, very few people who truly understand what's in that legislation. Even Nancy Pelosi, who famously said we have to pass it to find out what's in it, I'm sure still doesn't understand a tenth of what's in it. Now, I made up the 10th part. That was hyperbole for the purposes of broadcasting. But my guess is that Representative Pelosi probably knows less about what's in that bill than most of the people listening to this program who've actually been interested in and pursued trying to learn what was in that bill. But I digress. Here we are, roughly 3 months since the initial pre-filing of the bill here in South Carolina calling for the nullification of Obamacare, and we have it passed out of the subcommittee with a favorable opinion and sent to the full House Judiciary Committee, who are expected to, in all likelihood, pass that out to the House for a debate and a vote. Now, how quickly that'll happen, given that we are in the notorious budget season in the South Carolina General Assembly. Hold on to your wallets, folks, if you're in South Carolina. Or for that matter, if you're in another state. There are other states that often rail against South Carolina because we are a net consumer of federal taxes, as opposed to, say, California, which, some would argue actually pay more into the federal system than they get back, which is a crying shame, but that's a topic for another program. I'm not prepared to discuss that in any depth or length this evening, but I digress. All in all, not a bad day in South Carolina. We also had a bill pass out of a Senate subcommittee that calls for the nullification of the indefinite detention provisions of the National Defense Authorization Act that many believe unconstitutionally permits the federal government to detain U.S. citizens without due process. And that's a dangerous one, but we'll see where it goes from here. It is encouraging to see not only individuals with courage stepping forward to push these things in the face of overwhelming political opposition, not to mention overwhelming ignorance on behalf of a number of people who, because they either don't understand, are not capable of understanding, or who simply refuse to engage in the Socratic method of debate, have the only tools that they have in their bag are to ridicule or the odd ad hominem attack, who don't understand the notion of state sovereignty, the fact that our Constitution is a compact amongst the states, and the federal government is the object of that compact, and it is the states who determine the constitutionality of a law, in particular those laws that are enacted by the federal government that are not in pursuance of the Constitution. Said another way, If it isn't enumerated in the Constitution as a responsibility delegated to the federal government, then they have no jurisdiction over that issue. And it was humorous in part of the testimony that we heard today in the House subcommittee hearing that one of the legislators was questioning Kent Masterson Brown and trying to force him to point out where in the Constitution, precisely, where was the word nullification? Where was the word interposition? Where in the Constitution does it say that the states can do these sorts of things? Now, because the audience was under strict instructions not to have any outbursts or remarks or anything, otherwise they would be removed. I was biting my tongue because I wanted to scream out, the 10th Amendment comes to mind. But Masterson Brown, being a constitutional attorney, engaged with the representative, and then finally, out of I think one maybe a small amount of frustration, but also out of sarcasm, said to the representative, "Well, it's in the nature of the Constitution." And when pressed further, well, where, he said it's right there next to where it says that the federal government has the authority to compel me to buy health care insurance. Clearly the representative knew far too little about the law to be asking the questions that he did, but I digress. I'm going to take a quick break, and when I come back, even though I don't have the audio from the testimony today, there is companion audio that I would like to play from Walter E. Williams, where he was making basically the same argument, but to a different audience. And when we come back on the other side, we'll pick that up. You're listening to the Palmetto Conservative Show here on the Conservative Broadcast Media Network. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
DJ Trivia.
DJ Trivia is a fun, live, interactive trivia game involving several teams and a DJ host. Any subject may be among 20 multiple-choice questions shown on screen at your favorite bar or restaurant and can lead your team to the grand prize.
DJ Trivia.
If DJ Trivia is not yet at your favorite hangout, tell them to check out DJ Trivia by calling Nobody Entertainment at 864-915-8114. Find out everywhere DJ Trivia is across the upstate and in Asheville Sunday through Thursday night at upstatedjtrivia.com.
From Iraq and Afghanistan, our brave warriors are coming home, wounded. Some with wounds you can see, some with wounds you can't see. Wounded Warrior Project was created to support our men and women coming off the battlefield. Please help carry these warriors the rest of the way home. Get involved at woundedwarriorproject.org.
And welcome back into the Palmetto Conservative Show here on the Conservative Broadcast Media Network. I'm your host, Jim Lee. Thanks for being here this evening. As we made the turn there through the break and coming back, I had told you that I wanted to play a clip that is a little bit long. It's a little about 4 minutes or so, of Walter Williams in some audio that comes from the Rush Limbaugh show when Walter Williams was guest hosting, talking about this notion of nullification and interposition. And although it is not the exact testimony from today's presentation to the South Carolina House Judiciary Subcommittee. It is illustrative of the line of thinking and the scholarly thought that Mr. Williams, Professor Williams, has given to not only this, but pretty much everything he speaks about. Really enjoyed listening to his testimony because he did so in such a way where he was engaging, he was confident but gregarious, and just a pleasure to listen to. So this is Walter E. Williams talking a bit about nullification. We didn't have the music today on the testimony, however.
Suppose Congress enacted a law, and the Supreme Court ruled it constitutional, requiring American families to attend church services at least 3 times a month. Should we obey such a law?
Well, certainly there would be a huge and tremendous outcry over the separation of church and state, to be sure.
Or suppose you were a jury member during the 1850s, and a free person was on trial for assisting a runaway slave in clear violation of the Fugitive Slave Act. Would you have voted to punish the person? Well, a moral person would find each of those laws either morally repugnant or a clear violation of the Constitution. What I'm saying is that moral people cannot rely solely on the courts to establish what's right or wrong.
Now, this, of course, does beg the question, are we a moral people? You know, Adams said that our Constitution was intended only for a moral and religious people and wholly unsuited for any other. Kind of makes you wonder whether or not the Americans of today are of the same fabric, of the same makeup as those of our forefathers.
In the words of Thomas Jefferson, to consider judges as the ultimate arbiters of all constitutional questions is a very dangerous doctrine. And
that would be the Black Robe Regiment, I believe, as Mark Levin calls them.
Indeed, one that would place us under the despotism of an oligarchy. In 1798, Jefferson and Madison drafted what's known as the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. And they said, now listen to this, folks, they said, quote, resolved that the several states composing the United States of America are not united on the principle of unlimited submission to their general government. And whensoever the general government assumes undelegated powers, its acts are unauthoritative, void, and of no force.
Now there we are. Somebody brought up the N-word. No, not that N-word, the nullification word. Notice that he did this in the context not of calling for nullification, but rather quoting directly one of our founders and pointing out the grounds for which states could, in fact, declare something null and void.
Now, I think that makes it clear. And I think the American citizens ought to press their governors, their state governors, and legislatures just to nullify the law.
And that's exactly where we were. One with the bill that was pre-filed in South Carolina, House 3101, to nullify Obamacare, but also exactly what the grassroots has been pushing for with our governor and with our legislators, to understand that because the federal government really has no basis on which to compel citizens to buy health insurance, that so much of what's in the Obamacare legislation is outside of the realm of the federal government. It certainly goes well beyond any stretch of the imagination in terms of the Commerce Clause. But that said, what Mr. Williams suggests is precisely what we have been doing.
Just to plain nullify it and say the citizens of such and such a state don't have to obey Obamacare because it's unconstitutional, regardless of what the Supreme Court said. Well, maybe we have a governor with the courage. This is a story carried in the Washington Times, July 2nd. It's an exclusive interview with Florida Governor Rick Scott. He said, referring to Obamacare, "I will not implement this law. Florida will not implement Obamacare." Now, that, my friends, is a governor with guts. Now, before somebody calls up and says, "Well, Williams, the reason why Congress can do this, it's covered by the General Welfare Clause." Here's what James Madison said
Now, before we get into James Madison and what he had to say there, this is the basis that the Supreme Court recently ruled that Obamacare was in fact constitutional, that it was a tax, and under the authority to tax and under the notion of the Commerce Clause, that this was something they could do. The problem with that argument, however, or I should say the disingenuousness of that argument and the rationale, comes from the fact that, one, Obamacare was always argued that it was in fact not a tax. And secondly, that the legislation, when passed, did not contain the severability clause that is typically placed in legislation, such that if a piece or a component of the legislation is struck down as unconstitutional, the remainder of the legislation stands. In the case of Obamacare, they did not include that, which would indicate that their clear intent was that it was all or nothing. If any part was declared unconstitutional, the whole thing would be unconstitutional. But now, what Madison had to say.
Here's what James Madison said in a letter to Edmund Pendleton in 1792. "If Congress can do whatever in their discretion can be done by money and will promote the general welfare, the government is no longer a limited one possessing enumerated powers, but an indefinite one." Thomas Jefferson said the same thing. He says that Congress does not have the authority to do anything in the general welfare, but only those that are enumerated in the Constitution. And so I don't find any enumeration for health care in the Constitution. I do not even believe that the word health appears in the United States Constitution.
And Dr. Williams is absolutely correct. The word health does not appear in the Constitution anywhere. And nor do I find anything that would indicate that this is enumerated. But we'll wrap this up here in just 1 second.
So if it doesn't appear there, well, they can't do it. And that's what the enumerated powers mean, ladies and gentlemen. It means that if it is not among those 21 things that are listed in Article 1, Section 8, well, Congress cannot do it.
And there you have it. If it's not listed in Article 1, Section 8, the Congress cannot do it. And in the case of Obamacare, mandating health insurance, it's not there. It cannot be done. Now, the emotion, the political nonsense, and everything surrounding the mechanism by which states can do that is based on, in my view, three things. Most predominantly ignorance. Number two, those that really do want to see socialism and a single-payer system put in place. They believe that government is the answer. And then number three, the fact that the end game of all of this is all about control. And as what Mr. Williams pointed out about what Madison said in terms of whatever can be done by money will demonstrate exactly how far the citizens will go to give up their freedom. And, that's where we find ourselves with so many different things. We talk about federal money coming with strings attached. Well, that's exactly what it is. But it was a beautiful day in South Carolina, to borrow a phrase from our governor. And thankfully, that bill made it out of subcommittee. And I am hopeful that we'll see more and more activity like this at the state level. We already have 27 states who have already told the federal government we will not participate. We will not set up state-based exchanges, thereby pushing that responsibility back to the federal government, something that they were ill prepared for, something that they are ill prepared for. And there'll be more and more of that go on. And we will see Obamacare actually collapse under its own weight, or the Congress will get the message and they will in turn repeal Obamacare and perhaps replace portions of it with common sense policy that actually accomplishes the goals that were supposedly set out for Obamacare, which we'll talk about when we come back on the other side of the break. You're listening to the Palmetto Conservative Show here on the Conservative Broadcast Media Network. Stay tuned. We'll be back in just a couple minutes. Welcome back into the Palmetto Conservative Show here on the Conservative Broadcast Media Network. Hope you're doing well here. This Wednesday evening, the first day of spring 2013. We last left you reeling from the thoughts of Walter E. Williams and his rather sage analysis of the limits of the actions of the federal government and what the constitutionality of any particular law really means in light of, well, the Constitution, the 10th Amendment, and what the founders intended. Where we last left, we were talking about whether or not Obamacare could even fulfill its goals with all of the states that backed out of the exchanges, the states who have demonstrated, such as South Carolina, that there's a growing willingness, there is courage out there in the states to refuse to implement the unconstitutional and, quite frankly, unworkable provisions of Obamacare. And what will happen? Well, for sake of argument, if we would agree that the overarching goal of Obamacare was to get more people covered and do it at less cost, if that is the goal, has Obamacare demonstrated that it is on its way towards achieving that goal? And by every objective measure, by every objective analysis, the answer is not no, but hell no. It's not even remotely coming close. We are seeing the cost of health care, the cost of health insurance, rising disproportionately to the level of inflation. And we are seeing things such as reports from the Congressional Budget Office and from the GAO and others who even using the bronze level, the lowest level of insurance that will be available in the federal health insurance exchange, that individuals will see over 100% increase in their insurance premiums. In particular, for those who are in the youngest age brackets, those who are imminently insurable, those who are at the point of life where their health care costs are usually very, very low. Their use of the health care system is very, very minimal. And they're going to be seeing their premium costs just shoot through the roof. From a report by the Manhattan Institute, manhattan-institute.org, they have a project underway where they are endeavoring to look at 3 years after Obamacare's passage. The many key provisions of the legislation are now being implemented, and to try and get a perspective of whether or not Obamacare is on its way towards meeting its goals. The project is called Rhetoric and Reality, the Obamacare Evaluation Project, and looking at just cost, the Manhattan Institute, led by senior fellow Paul Howard, has come up with the following conclusions. First of all, they look at healthcare premiums, and backing up the way the authors tee up this study. They say that the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act, aka Obamacare, was described to the American public not only as a means of expanding coverage, but as a way of holding down spending on health care. As President Obama told the Washington Post in 2009, quote, "I think it's important for us to make sure that 46 million people who don't have health insurance get it. And I think it's important for us to bend the cost curve, separate and apart from coverage issues. Just because the system we have right now is unsustainable and hugely inefficient and uncompetitive. Now, it's not often that I patently agree with the current President of the United States, but I gotta agree with him in his characterization of the current healthcare system, that it is in fact unsustainable, it is hugely inefficient, and it is uncompetitive. The question in my mind is, why is it unsustainable? Why is it so inefficient? And why is it so uncompetitive? And you need to look no further than the supposed saviors of our healthcare system, the federal government and the state governments. In South Carolina, we have a de facto monopoly in terms of healthcare insurance. There are several, but in reality, it is a de facto monopoly because we do not have genuine competition. In terms of the inefficiency of our healthcare system, there are a variety of reasons for that, but most all of them point back to, again, government regulation and control. And then lastly, the unsustainability. Well, as the government continues to put more and more pressure on insurers and providers, and making it more and more difficult for practitioners to simply practice medicine, we are not educating and getting enough people into the healthcare system as practitioners to meet the ever-growing demand of an aging American population as well as an increasing American population. But that said, in this report by the Manhattan Institute, they took a look at Obamacare, where we're at in terms of healthcare premiums, and they conclude that since the passage of Obamacare, household premiums have increased a full 11.3%. Moreover, this increase even outpaced the rate of medical services consumer price index, which netted a mere 6.8% increase over the 3 years. Independent analysis also suggests that this trend will not slow down anytime soon. In 2012, the CBO and the Joint Committee on Taxation estimated that by 2016, employer-based family coverage will cost $20,000 a year. This will be an increase of $4,255 from 2012's total family premium of roughly $15,745 a year, a 27% jump. In terms of looking at healthcare spending, they conclude that Obamacare does little to actually stem spending growth, aside from some relatively small pilot projects on reimbursement reform that have had disappointing results thus far, either producing some savings but also some cost increases, or increasing outright healthcare spending. For instance, the implementation of electronic health records has thus far not only failed to decrease healthcare spending, but it seems to have increased it by making it easier for providers to bill for additional services. Ah, beware those unintended consequences of such prescient and well-written legislation. Now, I for one am not particularly surprised, because if you think about this, how does the federal government measure the success of the food stamp program? They measure success based on the number of people receiving food stamps, rather than the number of people transitioning off of food stamps and back to self-sufficiency. I mean, why does the food stamp program exist? It certainly doesn't exist just to redistribute income, does it? I don't recall that actually being the stated goal of the food stamp program, or SNAP as it's called. supplemental nutrition and whatever it's called. Perhaps I'll need to rethink this. Anyway, I digress. The point being, at the end of the day, Obamacare costs more, does little to stem spending growth, ostensibly the two key goals. So, thus far, and mind you, 2014 is the year when the rubber meets the road in terms of the implementation of Obamacare. That's when the vast majority of the program actually gets implemented. So at this point, Manhattan Institute grades Obamacare on controlling healthcare costs as a C. Weak evidence that reforms will achieve their intended goals, or growing evidence of unintended consequence. And that's from the Manhattan Institute. Now, the Manhattan Institute, one could argue, are they right wing? Are they left wing? Are they truly nonpartisan? Well, I'll leave that for you to decide. You can certainly go look it up. Their mission is that the Manhattan Institute is to develop and disseminate new ideas that foster greater economic choice and individual responsibility. And they grade Obamacare in terms of meeting its goals of cost cutting and cutting overall costs a C. Now, not to nitpick on the Manhattan Institute, but I would argue that if your definition of a C, which if we equate that to the typical letter grade scale that we use in schools, would be an average sort of result, and what they call a C is weak evidence that the reforms will achieve their intended goals, or growing evidence of intended consequences, I would say that without a doubt, if this is the rubric and the letter you want to ascribe to that description is a C, Obamacare clearly achieves a C. But that's not quite what I think they had in mind when they said they wanted more people covered at less cost. In listening to Kent Masterson Brown's testimony today, it was remarkable the number of things that he was saying that, in my view, hit this nail on the head that really anybody could see. He claimed that between Obamacare and the nearly 20,000 new regulations that have been promulgated, this nation is about to be plunged into chaos. And my favorite line from his testimony is that, Obamacare contains a parade of horribles. And in his testimony, he really only mentioned two. One being the increased costs in terms of health care insurance, and two, the fact that there are not one, but 11 different death panels contained within Obamacare. Now, they don't actually come out, and they're not codified in law and labeled as death panels, but they are entities that will ration care, which will have the same net effect. What are we to do with our friends and Obamacare? I, for one, believe that we don't even need to start 2014 and begin the implementation to find out exactly how bad it's going to be. Unlike Nancy Pelosi, I don't think it's necessary for us to implement Obamacare to find out how bad it's going to be. And quite frankly, with reasoning like that, I think she should be retired from the Congress. I think that perhaps someone might want to evaluate whether or not she's showing early signs of senility, because I can't imagine our forefathers in their debates on the floor of Congress, one of their members standing up and saying, we have to pass this bill in order to find out what's in it. That person would have been shown the door, ridden on a rail out of town, ridiculed mercilessly. The founders would not have stood for such an inane statement. But insofar as that's the logic upon which this bill was passed, using that same logic, I don't believe that we should have to implement Obamacare to find out how bad it's going to be. When you have as many independent bodies, such as the Congressional Budget Office, and so many independent studies, such as what the Manhattan Institute has found, when we realize that the federal government did not plan to have to run 27 states' healthcare exchanges because the states would opt out, I believe the prudent thing to do is to take a step back and insist that Obamacare be repealed. And before we replace the whole thing, let's go back and redefine what the statement of problem or opportunity is in the first place. And I can think of no better way to segue into the budget for 2014 than that. We're going to take a little pause for the cause here, come back on the other side, and pick up with Hour 2 of the Palmetto Conservative Show here on the Conservative Broadcast Media Network. Stay tuned, we'll be right back.
What can I see tonight?
Coming to you from sunny South Carolina, it's the Palmetto Conservative Show with your host, Jim Lee. From the upstate to the low country, from the coast to Columbia, we'll cover what's right and uncover what's wrong in the Palmetto State. If we see it, we say it. We call it like it is in South Carolina. And now, it's the Palmetto Conservative Show. Let's jam.
And welcome back into Hour 2 of the Palmetto Conservative Show here on the Conservative Broadcast Media Network. I'm your host, Jim Lee, snarky agitator, sometimes political junkie, often technology geek, and regular commentator on the miscellaneous and sundry things that pass as intelligence in our political discourse these days, in pursuit of critical thinking in the marketplace of ideas, particularly as it relates to the Palmetto State. We spent the first full hour actually talking about the Palmetto State, at least as it relates to Obamacare. Not everything we talk about will be down discreetly at the state level, although if you are in South Carolina, you know that South Carolina politics is unlike politics anyplace else. But we have our own unique brand, but there are so many things at the national level that impact us, not least of which is, the 2014 budget. We find ourselves getting ready to gear up for the next crisis du jour in Washington. We survived the fiscal cliff at the end of December, beginning of January. We moved on to the sequester, or the enactment of the Budget Control Act that brought us the now famous sequestration and its companion, sequestrionics. Sequestrionics, of course, are those rhetorical claims of impending doom, Armageddon, the sky falling, and everything else that has come out of this administration and continues to come out of this administration. Senator Harry Reid blames a training incident. We don't know whether it was human error or equipment failure that sadly killed 7 of our brave Marines in a training accident out in Nevada. Harry Reid shamelessly tried to tie that to the sequester. And I would argue that since sequester just took place, if there is anything having to do with not having the resources to properly prepare the munitions or the assembly of the munitions or anything else, it's just ridiculous on its face. Well, and quite frankly, pretty much everything Harry Reid does is ridiculous on its face, but I digress. In the midst of sequestrionics, we have the White House being closed, school tours, and we've canceled the annual Easter egg hunt, and we've eliminated all the various military air shows, and done exactly the wrong things to deal with an across-the-board cut that was the result of Congress's inability to actually do their bloody job, but to do the absolutely most damaging thing politically to the Republican Party. At a minimum, the president owns 100% of the responsibility for anything that is happening as a result of sequestration. Spare me the song and dance and the screaming and yelling and the whining and complaining that it's the recalcitrant Republicans and the Senate and all this other sort of nonsense. The buck stops at the White House. Now, that said, I would like to share the devalued buck from the White House with the leadership in the House and Senate as well. These Mensa candidates who came up with and codified in the Budget and Control Act these across-the-board cuts, and that were designed to create a political game of chicken, with the expectation that the Republicans would cave because they would not want to see their dear Defense Department be hit with across-the-board cuts, and the Democrats would cave because they wouldn't want to see a single dime of discretionary spending cut. Forget the fact that none of those things were really cuts anyway. They were just reductions in the rate of future increases. But none of that needed to happen. But it did. It was the crisis du jour. And now we're ready to move on to the next crisis. That one looks like it's going to be largely averted. And that would be the continuing resolution that will fund the government through the remainder of fiscal year 2013, which is what we are in the middle of. Take the government through September 30th. They would do so at the now reduced amounts as a result of sequestration. The Republicans taking stock in actually having obtained some quote-unquote cuts, meager as they are, cuts in the rate of future spending. But nevertheless, taking stock in those, declaring victory, and moving on to the next battle. The next battle will be this continuing resolution, which the House passed a version. The Senate, I believe, just passed a version of it with some amendments. Now the House has got to either concur on those, and it will supposedly be heading for the President's desk. And they will put that crisis behind us, because we have more crises to move on to. Lest we forget, there is the need for the fiscal year 2014 budget. And not too far on the heels of getting that process underway, we'll be talking about what we're going to do when we hit the debt ceiling, which is currently projected to occur sometime between April and May. So, if you're suffering from crisis fatigue, I feel your pain. I understand how you feel. But you're just going to have to buck up and get ready, because there's more coming. So we have the House, who has come out and proposed a budget. Paul Ryan and the Budget Committee put together a budget that ostensibly balances within 10 years. By the year 2023, it is not by any stretch of the imagination an austerity plan, because it in fact increases spending year upon year, somewhere in the 3 to 3.5% range. But it does cut back some funding for Obamacare. Some would argue that it actually repeals Obamacare. I have not read it in such detail to have drawn that conclusion. But it does all this without raising taxes, by implementing policy that would be more conducive to growth. And the goal is that over the course of 10 years, between controlling spending, growing the economy, that the percent of the federal budget, the debt, the deficit, and all will reduce as a percentage of the overall GDP. And we will be able to afford to make our debt payments and continue the current entitlement programs and so forth. Now, of course, that was declared dead on arrival by the Senate Democrat Senate leadership. And it may in fact be, because, well, quite frankly, there's pretty much anything the House has passed has been dead on arrival when it gets over to the Senate. That they took up the continuing resolution just tells you that the politics must really be so bad that the Senate finally had to give in. But the Senate, in turn, came out with their own proposed budget. Senator Patty Murray of Washington proposed or wrote or led the effort to write a budget by the Senate, which is interesting. I don't profess to be a constitutional scholar. I merely play one here on the Palmetto Conservative Show. But I believe that the appropriations bills and everything else having to do with raising taxes or spending money have to originate in the House. And then the Senate is welcome to amend those bills to their liking. And then we go through the reconciliation process. But, you know, the Senate coming up with their own is interesting. I can understand them coming up with their own budget framework or their ideas. But, hey, maybe I can get one of our constitutional attorneys or congressmen to come on the show and explain how that's supposed to work. But anyway, the budget that the Senate proposes never balances, increases spending by several trillion dollars, and increases taxes. It's a liberal's dream. Or, as Peter Ferrara calls it, brazen extremism. In a column in the American Spectator, Mr. Ferrara writes, "The Democrats' breakout budget, not Paul Ryan's restrained one, is what's extremist and radical." Democrat Party cheerleader, Representative Chris Van Hollen, Democrat, People's Republic of Maryland, ridicules Paul Ryan's House Republican budget as, quote, extremist and, quote, radical. Representative Steve Israel, Democrat, New York, used the Huffington Post platform to allege that Ryan's budget reflects, quote, extremist Tea Party control of the House Republican majority. Now, before I continue on with Mr. Ferrara's argument, or article rather, I thought the Tea Party was dead. Did I miss the press conference or the rally on Washington or whatever that indicated that the Tea Party was dead, or had come back to life, that Frankenstein had resurrected the Tea Party or something? I thought it was dead. But I digress. Mr. Ferrara continues, but it is the Senate Democrat budget that is extreme and radical, as I demonstrate below, reflecting extremist Socialist Party control of the Senate Democrat majority. Number one, bursting through the long-term post-war consensus on spending and taxes. For 60 years after World War II, from 1948 to 2008, federal spending as a percent of GDP was remarkably stable, hovering at around an average of 20%. During that same period, federal taxes were remarkably stable as well, hovering around an average of 18% of GDP. And historically, that is where federal taxes have been, regardless of what the rates end up being. The revenue generated by tax policy tends to hover around an average of about 18%, which seems to be the magic level of how much money you can squeeze out of the American economy. With federal spending and taxes at those levels, America was free enough to prosper during this time as the richest nation in world history, with resulting unprecedented military dominance as well. Ryan's budget merely returns federal spending and taxes back near those long-term post-war averages, with both federal taxes and spending after 10 years at 19.1% of GDP, almost perfectly splitting their long-term historical difference. It is abusive, dishonest rhetoric to call that, quote, extremist or, quote, radical. In reality, in returning America to those long-term post-war averages, Ryan's budget can only be called traditional. In sharp contrast, the Senate Democrat budget proposes to increase the current bloated levels of federal spending by $2.1 trillion a year by 2023 to $5.7 trillion in that 1 year alone, which would almost double Bush's 2008 federal spending of $2.983 trillion at the height of the financial crisis and all the bailouts. The Senate Democrat budget proposes to spend $46.4 trillion over the next 10 years, which would be the biggest government spending in world history, increasing annual federal spending over that time compared to this year's federal spending, which, side note, is already bloated beyond belief. It would increase annual federal spending over that time compared to this year's federal spending by a combined total of $10.4 trillion. That is what is extremist and radical. Even the home of Swedish socialism is turning away from big government spending, but not America's Democrat Party, which is now the world's leading left-wing party. At the insistence of President Obama and congressional Democrats, federal taxes have been raised twice already this year. That includes $1.1 trillion for the new Obamacare taxes that went into effect on January 1st, and $600 billion for the expiration of the Bush tax cuts for the nation's job creators, investors, and successful small businesses, which Socialist Democrat demagogues call the rich. The CBO now projects the federal revenue will double from $2.45 trillion in 2012 to nearly $5 trillion, $4.96 trillion, by 2023. But that is still not enough for the Senate Democrats, who propose in their budget still another $1.6 trillion in tax increases. That is what is extremist and radical. What the Senate Democrat budget proposes is effectively a big government breakout from the long-term post-war averages from 1948 to 2008 for both federal spending and taxes, permanently increasing both beyond those long-term averages. Indeed, because the Senate Democrat budget so zealously rejects any entitlement reform that would make any meaningful long-term difference, under that budget spending and taxes will soar well past their long-term post-war averages after the current 10-year budget window. That is what is extremist and radical. Ryan's plan balances the budget after 10 years with no further tax increases while continuing to increase spending every year by 3.4%. Now I'll pause at this point and just repeat that. The Ryan plan continues to increase spending every year by 3.4%. Apparently, balancing the budget is extremist and radical to today's Democrats, but we will see in 2014 that it is not so to the American people. After 10 years and another $1.5 trillion in tax increases, the Senate Democrats' own budget confesses that the federal deficit would still be $566 billion in 2023. That would be the highest federal deficit in American history, higher even than the former record Bush deficit of $458 billion in 2008, except for the 4 straight years so far of Obama deficits of over $1 trillion. Mr. Farrar continues on. and explains further the reasons why it's not the House Republican plan that Ryan proposes that is radical and extreme, but rather the Senate Democrat plan that is radical and extreme. Far so and to the left. To utterly unsustainable levels, with deficits and debt as far as the eye can see, and no credible economic basis for continuing their plan, other than because I wish it to be so. Our modern economy for the last 100 years has developed some rather predictable patterns as to how the economy responds to domestic policy, as well as foreign policy for that matter. The last decade of arguably optional wars have caused the United States government to spend trillions of dollars, funded in part by the hopes that the economy would continue to grow and the additional revenues from the economic growth offsetting those additional expenditures. Unfortunately, between the impact of 9/11 and the impact of the 2008 financial crisis, that hasn't quite worked out so well. But even those things notwithstanding, we know that predictable policy, predictable fiscal policy, and lower tax rates always result in additional revenues to the government. It's happened under Republican and Democrat administrations alike. We also have evidence of controlling spending having a positive impact on the economy. Yet this the Senate Democrat proposal for a 10-year budget plan flies in the face of all that we know to be true and that we have observed, as much as economics is a science. Yet what is it about these Senate Democrats? What is it about the likes of Representative Chris Van Hollen that they are unable to see beyond their own wishful thinking? That they cannot see that the parallel dimension that they live is so far removed from reality, that they think that these proposals will work. With the exception of Paul Krugman at the New York Times, who, for the life of me, I still don't understand how he won a Nobel Peace Prize, but then again, if President Obama can win one, why couldn't he? I just don't understand. Ryan's tax reform package, according to Mr. Ferrara, is another Republican middle-class tax cut. He states, as I first reported in this column months ago, Ryan's budget includes very positive tax reform, proposing to replace the current 7 tax rates in the individual income tax with just 2, 10% for families making below $100,000 and 25% for families making over $100,000. The New York Times, which is a Democrat Party-controlled publication, misleads its readers by saying, quote, naturally, Mr. Ryan doesn't explain how this could happen without raising taxes on middle and lower income people. That is a typical brain-dead comment from the Times, which reads these days like a college Marxist student newspaper. So let me correct the Times. Ryan is chairman of the House Budget Committee. It is not his job to explain how tax rates can be cut without raising taxes on middle and lower income people. Those details are never in the budget documents. That is the job of House Ways and Means Committee Chairman David Camp, in whose committee that tax reform bill will now be written. Now, let me scoop the New York Times. When Chairman Camp writes the tax reform legislation, it will involve another tax cut for the middle class. You see, the current tax rate of 15%, which applies to couples making between $17,850 and $72,500, will be reduced to 10%. The current 25% rate, which applies to couples making between $72,500 and $146,400, will be reduced to 10% for those making less than $100,000. Did you follow that? Because it was probably so simple that even though a caveman could understand it, economists and columnists at the New York Times probably couldn't. I digress. While Budget Committee Chairman has specified that the tax reform overall will be revenue neutral, which is to be achieved by reducing tax loopholes, deductions, and credits, even the Senate Democrat budget recognizes that those tax preferences primarily benefit the higher income taxpayers. Harvard economist Martin Feldstein, who is a former chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisors, explained last year in the Wall Street Journal, a much more honest and informative paper than the New York Times, that there are more than enough such tax preferences that can be reduced or closed to finance tax reform as Ryan has proposed, without raising taxes on the middle class or lower income taxpayers. Here is the scoop. When Camp passes his tax reform bill through his Ways and Means Committee, it will involve another major tax cut for the middle class. Indeed, with the middle 20% of income earners now paying just 2.7% of total federal income taxes, the Camp-Ryan tax reform bill may well eliminate federal income taxes on the middle class entirely. There you go. You read it here first. If you read this column every week instead of the New York Times, you will be ahead of the curve and much better informed about what is happening in Washington, D.C. and what is coming. When that happens, the New York Times will apologize to the American people for dishonestly misleading them when it should have known better, as I did with no investigative resources at all. Or there will be protests outside the Times in New York City demanding such an apology until it is forthcoming. Of course, the last major tax cut for the middle class was adopted in 2001 under a Republican majority Congress and Republican President George W. Bush. Most Democrats voted against that bill, though in permanently extending those middle-class tax cuts in January this year, President Obama and congressional Democrats tried to style themselves as great middle-class tax cutters. The debate is going to get so interesting in the coming weeks as we see these discussions take place regarding the 2014 budget. And we're just getting started. News Busted is next. On the other side, we'll come back. I want to play a clip from Mick Mulvaney talking about the Senate Democrat proposal and how it compares to the House proposal. And you can hear it in his own words. You're listening to the Palmetto Conservative Show here on the CB Media Network. Stay tuned. We'll be back in just a bit.
Hey everybody, welcome to News Busted. I'm Jody Miller. Let's get started. Catholic cardinals chose Buenos Aires Archbishop Jorge Bergoglio as the new pope. He took the name Pope Francis and will make rulings on every facet of his followers' lives. You know, just like Mayor Bloomberg. The choice of Pope Francis has already upset many liberals. Apparently, they think the Pope's religious beliefs violate the separation of church and church. Americans celebrated St. Patrick's Day this past weekend, or as Governor Chris Christie calls it, the time to get shamrock shakes. A New York judge struck down Michael Bloomberg's ban on sodas over 16 ounces. So in order to reinstate the ban, Bloomberg will now attempt to reclassify the large drinks as assault sodas. Russia is demanding an inquiry into the death of Hugo Chavez. After all, Chavez had the best medical care Cuba had to offer. What could have gone wrong? During his speech at CPAC, Mitt Romney admitted to making some mistakes during his campaign. But an upbeat Karl Rove said that he still might win Ohio. A New York woman surprised fellow shoppers at a Walmart when she had a baby right in the store. Shoppers were surprised because they assumed there was nothing in Walmart still made in the USA. And finally, the TV show American Idol has hit its lowest ratings ever. Things are now so bad, last week the audience nearly voted off Judge Randy Jackson. Thanks for watching News Busted, everybody. I'm Jody Miller. Please make a tax-deductible donation at savenewsbusters.org. We'll catch you next time.
Welcome to the Bureau of Womanhood Conformity. Independent thoughts are considered subversive because all must agree with our leader.
When it comes to women, preventative care should include coverage of contraceptive services such as birth control.
You see, if you don't believe government should pay for your birth control, you're not a real woman. Womanhood denied. If you refuse to accept that pregnancy is a punishment, you're denied as well.
I don't want them punished with a baby.
If you don't believe that abortions should be allowed for any reason, if you don't believe in aborting a child for being the wrong gender, and if you don't believe that stay-at-home mothers aren't real workers, you are not a real conformed woman.
His wife has actually never worked a day in her life. His wife has actually never worked a day in her life.
Finally, for your safety, if you oppose mandatory government health care, you will die.
They will be voting to say that women can die on the floor.
These standards and regulations were formed after our glorious victory in the war on women. Thank you for your cooperation and your conformity.
And on the 9th day, God spilled some coffee on an angry possum, and God made a liberal. God said, I need someone willing to get up at the crack of noon and check their Facebook and tweet vile things, take a nap, borrow money from their parents, and stay out all night drinking Pabst ironically and snorting bath salts and wine until midnight. So God made a liberal. He said, I need a person that can take a thriving community and turn it into a debt-ridden post-apocalyptic welfare state. I need someone who thinks meat is murder, produce is raised in grocery aisles, who can't fix a flat tire or change her own oil, and who, when forced to finally get a job as a barista, makes you wait for your latte while they play Angry Birds on their iPhone and then takes his union-mandated 2-hour break. So God made a liberal. God said, I need somebody dumb enough to believe in global warming and deficit spending, yet arrogant enough to look down at hard-working folk because they don't have a worthless PhD in 17th century Belgian lesbian studies. It had to be someone that would tax and spend, sue and attack, flip and flop, legislate from the bench and pass an unread bill. A person that would take a story of American success and turn it into a lesson of injustice. So God made a liberal. It had to be someone who'd lie to themselves and others and envy the successful. Someone to whine, cry, demand, screech, and scream sexist, intolerant, xenophobic, homophobic, Islamophobic, racist, bigot. It had to be someone that at the end of the day they could go home after helping rip apart a country with divisive race and class war, and who would laugh and then sigh with mocking eyes, thinking, if I hadn't aborted all my children, they'd probably say they want to spend their life doing what Dad does. So God made a liberal.
And welcome back into the Palmetto Conservative Show here on the Conservative Broadcast Media Network. I'm your host, Jim Lee, as we wind our way towards the top of the hour and the end of the program today. Been enjoying this evening's rant. Hopefully you have as well, and give you some things to think about, particularly around the 2014 budget, Obamacare, and nullification topics for this evening. I told you before the break that after we'd spent some time talking about the 2014 budget and an article by Joseph Ferrara about the Paul Ryan plan and the Senate Democrat plan and how extreme and radical it is, I thought I'd play a little bit of a speech that South Carolina Republican Representative Mick Mulvaney had on the floor of the House talking about the Senate budget.
As a substitute, the budget that passed as a substitute, the budget that passed the Senate Budget Committee last week. It's the first budget, by the way, to pass out of a Senate budget. In fact, the first budget to be taken up by the Senate, I believe, in 4 years.
Yes, the first budget to be taken up in 4 years. So the House Republicans, who have repeatedly passed budgets every year, as is required by the Constitution as part of their duties, and they pass those, send them over to the Senate, where they languish on the desk and never see the light of day, thanks to the superior leadership of Senator Harry Reid. The Senate Democrats finally decided to take up a budget. And after 4 years, it ought to be a beaut, right?
I'd like to think it's a direct result of the bipartisan action that this body took several weeks ago in passing No Budget, No Pay. The Senate assures us, Mr. Chairman, that they were going to do a budget anyway. I take them at their word, but I'm glad that this body was able to pass out No Budget, No Pay in order to give them the additional incentive to do that. So what have they done? What has the Senate offered us? What did the Senate pass out of committee last week on entirely partisan lines? They offered...
Yes. What did they pass out? Tell us, what did they pass out, Representative Mulvaney?
Offered us a budget that increases taxes by $900 billion over the tax window. In fact, that's the smallest amount. That's the amount they admit to. If you take the Senate committee at their word that they also want to undo the sequester and add an additional $100 billion worth of stimulus money, and they want to do that without impacting the deficit, you can safely assume, I believe, that it's $1.5 trillion, not $900 billion, $1.5 trillion in new taxes out of our colleagues in the Senate on the Democrat committee.
So they're going to raise taxes to the tune of anywhere between $900 billion to $1.5 billion, depending on how honest you want to be about what's in it. Of course, you know, it could be that the Democrats are following the approach of Representative Pelosi, that you have to pass it to understand what's in it, so that's why they can't give you a precise number. I don't know.
They increased spending by $265 billion over the baseline over the next decade, and they also spend $4.9 trillion more than does the Republican budget that we'll offer later on today. Their spending, as offered in their budget, grows by 4.7% annually, one of the highest rates of growth other than the last several years in the history of the nation. The deficit, according to their budget, in the year 2023 will be $566 billion. In contrast, the budget that we will be offering will be surplus in 2023, and will finally allow us to start paying down the debt. There are no reforms, no significant reforms at all in Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. How you can have a vision for this country going forward and not at least discuss possible reasonable reforms to those programs is beyond me, but somehow it passed out of the Senate committee.
Makes you wonder about the sincerity, the seriousness of the Senate Democrat budget writers. Or perhaps it's really more of a case of mistaken priorities. Maybe it's that the Senate Democrats view as a priority increasing taxes and increasing spending, and that they don't view that the responsibilities of the government and fulfilling those responsibilities are the priorities. Maybe they don't view preserving the earnings of individual taxpayers as a priority. Maybe, just maybe, they view taxing and spending as their ultimate priority. Because after all, isn't the Democrat Party really known as the party of tax and spend?
Defense is cut by an additional $250 billion. Cut by an additional $250 billion over the sequester cuts that we've already had and over the reductions that the Defense Department voluntarily took upon itself during the last budget process. Now, I have come before this body, Mr. Chairman, and encouraged this body in a bipartisan fashion to look to the Defense Department as possible ways to save money, under the belief that there must be some money in the Defense Department that can be saved in a responsible fashion.
Now, one would think that if that same line of reasoning were valid for the Department of Defense, which granted is a substantial portion of the federal budget, I believe it's somewhere in the 16-17% range, though I could be wrong, but I believe that's about where it's at. What about those other programs that make up the remaining 80% of the federal budget? Do you think that perhaps, just maybe, there's something that could be cut in those budgets? Just saying.
What the Senate has done goes so far beyond that it's hard to fathom. An additional $250 billion in defense spending reductions over the next 10 years. Finally, and perhaps most tellingly and most importantly, the Senate budget never balances. Ever. Never balances. What does that say? They have no plan for ever repaying the debt. You cannot repay the debt until we start moving to surplus. And any budget that never goes to surplus never pays down the debt. I say it before, I say it again. If you borrow money from people never intending to pay it back, you're not borrowing it from them, you're stealing it from them. And that's exactly what this budget contemplates. Borrowing money with no intention, a stated position of no intention to ever be able to pay the money back.
And that, in my view, is the key point in what Representative Mulvaney is saying here. But let me say it in a slightly different way. When you are spending that much money above and beyond your means, you are not borrowing, you are in fact stealing. And what we are doing here is not simply borrowing from our children and grandchildren's future. We are stealing it from them. Outright, not petty larceny, but grand theft. And to do so in such a brazen, unserious, irresponsible manner, and yet to vilify the Republican budget, which in my view does not go far enough, shows precisely how partisan, not bipartisan, but how partisan the Senate Democrats are.
I'm glad they did it. I'm glad they did it. I'm glad to think that they did it of their own accord without no budget, no pay hanging over their head. And I applaud them for at least taking the first step in the last 4 years to put forth their vision of spending and what the future of this country should hold. At the same time, I think it's incumbent upon us to have this debate and then to send a very strong message to the Senate that their ideas are not the right ideas for this country, and I hope we get a chance to debate this further. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlemen, reserve.
That was South Carolina Representative Mick Mulvaney, Republican from South Carolina, offering comments about the proposed Senate Democrat budget. And as he characterized it, it really is a tale of two visions. Visions that are deeply, deeply at odds with one another that must be reconciled. Now, whether they will be reconciled because of the threat of no budget, no pay, which in my view is nothing but a big political gimmick, but it's symbolic in and of itself, or whether enough pressure is beginning to mount from underneath that requires Congress to actually act and do its job as a whole for the first time in over 4 years and produce a budget which, again, is nothing more than a plan that reflects the priorities of those making the plan. And since those making the plan should be doing so on behalf of those whom they represent, that would be we the people. These two competing plans really demonstrate, in my mind anyway, varying levels of contempt for the intelligence of the American people. Now, in fairness, there is a segment of the American people whose intelligence should be held in contempt. Let's face it, folks, we get the government we deserve. It's bad enough that the American people have elected not once but twice someone so patently unqualified to be in the office of President of the United States. It's bad enough that the House Republicans have elected a leader as Speaker of the House who has demonstrated time and time again that he holds no principled backbone. The fact that in the Senate we have a Senate Majority Leader who has demonstrated time and time again his absolute partisanship and incompetence and inability to produce a budget for over 4 years consistent with their responsibilities. But that said, one vision calls for finally balancing the budget after 10 years and then beginning to address this increasingly and ever-growing mountain of debt that now stands at roughly just under $17 trillion. And another vision that never addresses it and cannot see the need to balance the budget at all. Now, I'm going to tell you, of the two visions, I prefer the House Republican plan. But even at that, it's timid, because it assumes that we can continue down this path in light of all of the other events going on around the world without making drastic decisions and putting in place policies that bring the federal government under control. And the other vision that demonstrates not only an unseriousness, but an absolute, complete lack of understanding of basic math and economics. It's up to us, folks, we the people. There's a quote from H.L. Mencken that I believe is going to make its way into the rotation here on the Palmetto Conservative Show. It goes like this: the men the American people admire most extravagantly, are the greatest liars. The men they detest most violently are those who try to tell them the truth. Well, it's clear that the mainstream media detests most violently Paul Ryan, the Republicans, the Tea Party, those who are most conservative, those who are calling for not draconian, not austere, but responsible changes in our federal government and here in the Palmetto State in our state government. But it seems that the American people admire most extravagantly those like the Senate Democrats whose plan is a lie. It is a lie to continue to feed bovine fecal matter to the American people and yet tell them it's some sort of pate. We have reached that point where we cannot continue down this path. Before us here, and let me just go through a couple of quick examples. We have a federal government that has within its budget the ability to provide for federal studies to the tune of $27 million as to why do lesbians have higher risk of hazardous drinking, and another $15 million to study why lesbians are obese, and millions of dollars to study shrimp on treadmills. And the list goes on and on and on, which on a budget the size of $3.7 trillion, that doesn't sound like big money. But if these are the ones that we actually see in a gargantuan federal bureaucracy of at least 2.7 million people and literally thousands of agencies and redundant programs comprised of Byzantine regulations and a leviathan the size of which the average person really cannot fathom, and for that matter, that most people in Washington cannot fathom nor understand. There has to be a way to responsibly trim the federal government. That's only going to happen when we, the people, insist that it happen. As we do every week here on the Palmetto Conservative Show, I encourage you to get engaged. If you're in the Palmetto State, if you want to have an impact even remotely in the political process, I encourage you to get involved in Republican Party precinct reorganization, which is taking place as we speak. In the upstate of South Carolina, Greenville and Spartanburg counties will be holding precinct reorganization next Monday night, March 25th at 7 p.m. Engage in consistent constituent contact with your elected officials and let them know specifically how you feel and what you think about what's going on in the State House. Begin a dialogue, a respectful but candid and frank dialogue with your federal delegation members as well. And get out and talk to at least one person a week and explain to them how important it is that they get involved and engage or we will continue to get the government that we deserve. You've been listening to the Palmetto Conservative Show here on the Conservative Broadcast Media Network. Thank you for being here this week. It's been a rapid 2 hours for me. Hopefully it's gone quickly for you as well. God willing and the creek don't rise, we'll be back next week with another edition of the Palmetto Conservative Show. Have a great week, folks. We'll see you next week.